Because of why I search the deep through endless nights, no time to sleep. The call inside I can't deny. I'll find the light because of why.
For 2 centuries, when you thought of the word neutrality, one country probably popped into your head: Sweden. But that long era is officially over. Sweden just joined NATO, a move that completely redraws the security map of Europe, and honestly leaves us with a pretty fascinating question. So, how does a country that practically defined non-alignment for generations suddenly flip the script and join a military alliance? Well, the answer is a lot more complicated than the official story lets on, and it all starts 200 years ago. Okay, so let's rewind a bit. The official policy really began right after the Napoleonic Wars. See, Sweden had just lost a massive piece of its territory, what is now modern-day Finland, to Russia. They decided, you know what, our days as a great power are over. It's time for a totally new game plan: peace. And this right here is the cornerstone of that whole strategy. In 1834, King Charles XIV John sent this formal letter to Britain and Russia, basically putting it in writing: Sweden is neutral. This became more than just a policy. It got woven into the very fabric of their national identity. And you know what? You can't really argue with the results. This policy brought over 200 years of unbroken peace, one of the longest streaks in modern history. Sweden sat on the sidelines for 2 world wars and the entire Cold War, which of course makes that 2022 date at the bottom of the list a pretty huge deal. But here's where the story gets really interesting. While neutrality sounds like this rigid, absolute principle, for Sweden, it has always been an incredibly pragmatic and flexible strategy. See, the real goal was never about some abstract ideal of neutrality. It was always about one thing: survival. And boy, was that flexibility put to the ultimate test during World War II. Sweden found itself in an impossible position, totally surrounded. You had Nazi Germany occupying Denmark and Norway on one side, and the Soviet Union fighting Finland on the other. I mean, talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So what do you do in that situation? Well, Sweden basically played both sides. To keep the Germans at bay, they made huge concessions, letting millions of German troops cross their land and supplying the iron ore that literally fueled the Nazi war machine. But behind the scenes, it was a whole other story. They were secretly training Allied soldiers, passing along critical intelligence, and toward the end of the war, even letting the Allies use their air bases. It was a masterclass in doing whatever it takes to survive. They even got creative with the definition of neutral. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland, Sweden declared itself non-belligerent, which is a very clever way of saying, hey, we're not officially in this war, but you better believe we're going to help our Finnish neighbors with weapons, supplies, and even volunteers. Now, after the war, Sweden burnished its reputation as this global voice for peace. But as the world plunged into the Cold War, that gap between its public image and its secret reality, well, it got even bigger. On the world stage, Sweden was like a moral compass. They'd criticized both the United States and the Soviet Union. They championed the non-aligned movement. They were mediators in big conflicts. They really looked the part of a truly independent nation. But behind closed doors, well, U.S. defense documents from that time had a very different name for Sweden: a functional ally. So even though it wasn't an official member of NATO, it was secretly and very deeply aligned with the West. And when you look at the details, the level of this secret cooperation is just, wow, it's staggering. Sweden had security guarantees under the American nuclear umbrella. It was constantly sharing intelligence with NATO, it built its runways to fit U.S. bombers, and it even integrated its radar systems with the alliance. For all practical purposes, Sweden was already a silent partner. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of that need for secrecy just kind of faded away, and the public policy started to shift. The word neutrality was quietly phased out and replaced with military non-alignment. Now, that might sound like semantics, but it was a really crucial shift. It was Sweden signaling that, hey, while we're not joining an alliance, our values are definitely not neutral anymore. And this move toward the West wasn't some accident. It was a very deliberate step-by-step process. First, they joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Then, they joined the EU, which has its own mutual defense clause. Then,
After Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, military cooperation with NATO got even tighter. So when you look at it this way, the decision in 2022 wasn't some sudden shock. It was really just the final step on a journey they'd been on for decades.
So that brings us to the big question. What was the final push? What was the one thing that made Sweden finally take that historic step and officially end a 200-year-old policy? It really all comes down to one date, February 24th, 2022, the day Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was a political earthquake that just shattered the old security assumptions across all of Europe. And you can see the effect of that invasion, plain as day, right here in the public opinion polls. For decades, most Swedes were solidly against joining NATO. But just look at this jump. Support went from 37% in January to 64% just a few months later. The game had completely changed, literally overnight. And then there was the final piece of the puzzle, Finland. For years, one of Sweden's arguments for staying out was that it didn't want to isolate its neighbor, Finland. But when Finland, which shares that huge border with Russia, decided to join NATO, and fast, that argument just evaporated. All of a sudden, staying out of NATO meant Sweden would be the one left all alone and exposed. Which kind of brings us to this really interesting final thought. Was this decision a betrayal of Swedish history? Or was it actually the most Swedish decision they could have possibly made? The ultimate act of that flexible, pragmatic tradition of doing whatever it takes to stay safe. So, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. Sweden's famous neutrality was never really about a secret, rigid ideology. It was a tool, a brilliant and highly successful 200-year strategy for survival. And when the world changed so drastically, Sweden just did what it's always done. It picked up a new, better tool for the job. In this case, a NATO shield. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. First, Sweden's 200-year neutrality was always about pragmatism and survival, not ideology. Second, during the big conflicts of the 20th century, they were secretly cooperating with the West the whole time. And third, the 2022 invasion of Ukraine was simply the catalyst that made decades of secret policy public and official. It's just an incredible story of national survival and smart strategy, isn't it? What do you think about this 200-year balancing act? I'd really love to hear your take, so drop a comment below. And of course, if you found this deep dive helpful and it cleared things up for you, do us a favor and hit that like button, share it with someone who might be interested, and definitely subscribe for more explainers on the big stories shaping our world. As always, thanks so much for watching. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one.